Hello and welcome back to another Dynamic Foveated Rendering video because I cannot get enough of this feature and the performance improvements that go beyond a generational leap that it can provide. Today we're going to be looking mainly at some more benchmarks, but this is also going to be a bit of a deeper dive into also checking how noticeable it actually is in various games and making some recommendations for which things to use based on that, as that's what some people were asking about. Because there are three values that Pimax has to use with foveated rendering, those being minimum, balanced, and maximum. I've done a previous video about DFR, so go there if you'd like to see some comparisons between fixed foveated rendering or a brief overview of how this form of DFR works, that being variable rate shading. But I do want to mention one very important fact as a little disclaimer. This feature is exclusive to NVIDIA GPUs, with Pimax and with most methods that are going to be using it. AMD just physically lacks support for VRS outside of DirectX 12. So if you're using AMD, you're out of luck here. Sorry. Anyway, making this video because I unawarely ended up benchmarking it on the lowest setting in that video, as a couple clients ago, Pimax swapped what minimum and maximum were in the UI, but the toggles associated with them were not switched. So the maximum setting was actually minimum. And I'd rather show what the ceiling is on a feature rather than just the floor. If Pimax has fixed this, I'll include editor's note on screen or I'll have a pinned comment for it. But to avoid confusion because of this bug, I will be referring to the lowest setting as conservative, middle setting as balanced, and then the highest as aggressive. Anyway, before we get into the benchmarks, I also want to illustrate how much more aggressive each setting is for the foveation, because there's a pretty massive difference between the lowest and highest settings. But in some cases, there are definitely real performance benefits to using higher levels of foveation. And simply because using fixed foveated rendering won't work as well as dynamic, because due to the static nature and high clarity of the lenses like the crystals, FFR can start becoming noticeable versus when it follows your eyes with DFR, and you can thus push higher settings with it. And this is something Pimax has actually accounted for as well. Let me illustrate with this uncropped but stretched to fit 16:9 view of the right eye of the crystal. Using an absolute worst case scenario here for visibility's sake, look at how the radius changes starting from conservative settings, then balanced FFR to DFR, gets a fair bit smaller, and then finally aggressive FFR to DFR, where the circle gets very tiny. So, as you can see, it's quite a noticeable change in the size of the circle that has the full detail. And in the recording, yeah, it was very easy to see the artifacting. And in this specific case, yes, it was also so bad in the headset, I started wondering if this is what a seizure feels like. However, despite how small the full fidelity circle can get, there are situations and games where even on the most aggressive settings, it can be pretty hard to notice, because inside the actual headset, and due to working on the same principles as our eyes do, we only see full resolution in a pretty tiny area. It's nowhere near that noticeable in practice, thankfully, most of the time. It's really just going to depend a bit on the context, and will also depend on the person because, well, everyone's standards are going to be different and it can vary from scene to scene. A little more on that later. So in addition to the benchmarking, I'm going to be addressing games on a 0 to 5 scale for how noticeable DFR is and making some recommendations on which one to use. This is entirely independent of the performance uplift. 0 means that the artifacting is so bad as to be basically broken. What I showed just a minute ago would be an example of a 0 out of 5. 1 to 2 means that some artifacting can start becoming present on higher settings, but it is subtle enough that with the most conservative setting, and when you're immersed in the game, not actively trying to pixel peep, probably going to be unobstructive. 3 to 4 means that it works well enough you can likely consider going up to balanced without worrying much about distracting artifacting, and you might even be able to consider aggressive if you really do want performance. And anything above 4, that means you could start giving serious consideration to the most aggressive settings without major issues, as the artifacting is incredibly subdued and can be hard to find even if you are actively looking for it at the higher levels. These ratings are sort of just a general guide and may change a bit depending on the settings you use as well. Some settings can produce more artifacting than others. Here's a brief little example on screen from Microsoft Flight Sim 2020. So it may be worth experimenting a little bit with your settings to find the right fit. It also assumes your eye tracking is functioning properly, because the eye tracking on the crystal, it is very accurate, but it is also very, very sensitive to being in the wrong spot. If it slides even a little bit out of place, the accuracy can start degrading noticeably. This all said, let's get into the test configurations and methodology, as there's a couple important notes I gotta give here. I tested on 2 systems, the first consisting of an RTX 4090, 7950X3D, 32GB of CL30 6000MHz DDR5 RAM, and then running at the maximum resolution on the crystal, which corresponds to around 4312 by 5100 per eye, unless noted otherwise. In this system, I made one very essential tweak to my X3D of applying an affinity mask so that the game only runs on the V-cache cores, while other processes run on the frequency core, as due to the dual CCD design and AMD's poor scheduling, default behavior can sometimes noticeably impact CPU performance. The second system was an Alienware X17R2 gaming laptop with a mobile 3080 Ti, 175-watt version, 12900HK, 32GB of CL40 4800MHz DDR5 RAM, and then also running at the same resolution, except when noted otherwise in some tests. The laptop was also run in dedicated GPU mode, no Optimus here sucking performance, so it should be roughly comparable to a desktop 3070, give or take a little. Methodology-wise, a couple notes here as well. Firstly, Pimax's DFR only works with OpenVR titles right now. No OpenXR support this time. So those are the only kind of games I could test. Secondly, I didn't want to just stare straight ahead and keep my eyes not moving, because while that would make things more one-to-one, it's not really reflective of real-world usage, and that'd just effectively be FFR. So during testing, I would generally move my eyes around to anything in the benchmark scene which just happened to grab my attention, generally trying to look at similar things though. However, considering the micro movements our eyes can make, and I might just happen to look somewhere else from one scene to the next, I'd say assume a little bit of extra variance can potentially crop up, so anything that's only a few % difference or less may simply be run-to-run variance. I did multiple passes on things and was about always less than 3 to 4%, but it is something to consider on top of the typical run-to-run variance. So, that all said, let's kick things off with a game I have the most to talk about, Skyrim, running the October 28th update of the Minimalistic Overhaul mod pack. So to kick things off with Skyrim and the 4090 with the mod pack, I'm running at stock settings with a few tweaks such as running FSR quality, which is 0.77 render scale in the mod, DLAA, reflex, and disable grass FPS booster since it oddly caused lower FPS with this specific setup. And right away there is a pretty notable increase, way more than when I last benched this. 34.3% with the most aggressive form of DFR, and then conservative is still providing 24.9% on average. Were I not recording, this could be the difference between 45 or 60 FPS reprojection, because with DFR, even the 1% lows are still hovering around 60 FPS or so, whereas even without recording, no DFR would still see notable dips below 60, and the experience gets so much worse if you can't maintain your target frame rate. And CPU frame times are really well controlled too. They actually were much worse originally, but I reached out to the mod list creator, Hitmantb, and he was able to quickly help find the issue and make a fix. But there is still more to talk about here, as there are scenes where we can see even higher gains well past the average of what we're seeing in this one. Let's go check out one such scene right now. Looking here at Fort Greymore in some combat, it's not like for like, but the difference is so absurd, even with it being somewhat similar is enough. With aggressive DFR, I'm actually refresh rate capped and semi-hertz limited. Few dips during combat though. Yet, I'm still gaining over plus 53% performance versus no DFR. And in this context, with the lower light, a bunch of things at once going on, even on the most aggressive settings, I don't notice anything. It's truly invisible for me, and an otherworldly better experience, and anyone who's experienced such FPS changes can attest to that. So with such utterly absurd gains on the 4090, it feels like a 5090 in places, you might think, why not always leave it on, right? Well, Skyrim unfortunately has a bit of a bug with foveated rendering, particularly concerning foliage and the daytime. Look at this clip right now where you can watch it occur in real time during a worst case scenario with different weather than the benchmark run. When walking up to the trees, they appear fine, but when I get really close, it's, yeah, really bad and really distracting. As I get even closer, some of it does disappear, but even on conservative settings, you're likely gonna see some of it. This is just a fundamental issue in Skyrim because it happened with Fuss, it happened with a vanilla install, but it really just depends on the weather too. Some weathers, even during the day, it becomes subtle enough on conservative or balanced, I wasn't sure if it was on at times. And that was the case during the benchmark run. I believe it might have something to do with the lighting. In particular though, during nighttime it is vastly less noticeable, but on aggressive settings, you can still see some artifacts at times. But it is far less subdued at least, and I could actually see some people rolling with conservative, perhaps even balanced, settings depending on the kind of weather they're playing with. But this is mostly a problem in the open world. When wandering around places like say Whiterun or indoors, it's mostly fine when walking around even a bunch, but it's still not entirely unavoidable in some cities, as you can see right here in Whiterun. But if you're playing in the right weather and it's not just nighttime, the gains are so high, I think some people would be fine to tolerate it. I'll probably be running balanced at all times myself, though I will sometimes be having to change the weather to ensure foveation artifacts are minimal. But because of how wild the variance is due to this bug, I gotta give Skyrim 2 ratings for the mod pack. In the open world, during a worst case, it's a 0. The artifacting is just truly terrible and it's quite distracting. But the performance gains are so high and conservative settings are, well, conservative enough that you might still find it bearable in some spots as long as you, again, play in a good weather. But when it comes to best case weather, such as night or smaller areas like caves and buildings, I'd probably give it a 2.5, maybe a 3 overall. Sometimes it's really hard to notice even on the most aggressive settings, but it's not consistently like that, and stopping to change DFR settings all the time would just be way too much of a pain. For the 3080 Ti mobile, because the 4090 is in a higher plane of existence versus this weak little thing, I dialed things back with the Fus mod pack ver 4.1.3, with the Fus Rodin preset at 3232 by 3824 per eye. But I did have to disable reshade, as this mod pack will crash with DFR enabled when trying it, and DLA was sharpened and cranked up to ludicrous levels of 1.0, because that actually made it look surprisingly sharp for what it was, especially with having to downsample the resolution a bit. And again here, we're seeing some scaling between the presets. Unfortunately, the gains are noticeably lower than on the 4090, a very rare inversion of what we usually see, with only around plus 25.5% using the most aggressive form of DFR. Could perhaps be GPU differences, or could be that ENB, which the overhaul uses, responds much better to foveation than community shaders, which Fus uses, the fact overhaul has just a lot more effects in general, or perhaps a combination of all of the above. Still, it is a meaningful boost. Unfortunately, DFR is completely unusable with this mod pack because of one other particular bug it has with it. It just does not like this feature. Let's jump to Fort Greymore here, and there is a massive increase with aggressive DFR versus none, well past the average, just like before. But the thing is that something is causing the CPU frame times to slowly creep up over time. Check out how I started at nearly 80 FPS, but after a couple minutes it degraded down to around 70. I did literally nothing but just sit here for a few minutes, and yet this happened, and it keeps dropping the longer I wait. This just doesn't appear to be thermal throttling. Utilization, both overall and of threads, appears to stay roughly the same throughout the benchmark on the CPU, not the GPU though. And this didn't happen when not using DFR. Going back to the benchmark runs, I actually had to restart between each run because of this behavior. But on the minimalistic overhaul, I didn't have that issue occur. And I can't pinpoint what the mod could possibly be that's causing this with Fus. Noticeability wise though, again, it's basically the same. 0 in the open world during the day, 2.5 to 3 or so elsewhere. I've observed some really unusual behavior with Skyrim and DFR, so I'm thinking I might make a video dedicated solely to that, maybe check out a couple of the gains and visual impacts with various mod packs and settings. Let me know in the comments if that's something you might like to see and what locations you'd like to see from that. Moving on to another high-fidelity game with the 4090, we have Kayak VR Mirage, which was run on completely maxed out settings, no DLSS or FSR here. And after having such incredible results in Skyrim and a variety of places, the results here are incredibly underwhelming. Even on the most aggressive setting, DFR only provided slightly over plus 7% performance. It was still an increase outside of run-to-run variants, but unless you go for the heaviest settings, it's basically nothing. And I can't say it's worth using on the 4090 if you're even a little bit sensitive to artifacting. One important thing to note though is that the CPU frame times did stay more or less the same when using it, which is good because that was not the case in Skyrim. Noticeability wise, the game actually fared rather well on these settings and resolution. It can depend a bit on the map, but if the eye tracking is all working well, I'd say it's a solid 4. It's just a shame we don't actually gain much from it. If you enable DLSS or FSR though, drop that rating down to a 1 to 3 depending on how heavy the upscaling is, the shimmering in the peripheral does become a lot more noticeable. Now moving on to the 3080 Ti Mobile, I had to really dial things back, running on medium settings but cinematic textures and AA, with FSR set to quality. Chose FSR because DLSS only has numbers 1 to 5 and I don't know which level those correspond to. And unfortunately, the story is basically the same thing here. Only about 4.7% improvement on average FPS with the most aggressive one, lows rising somewhat proportionally. We get basically nothing here, and due to the upscaling, artifacts start becoming more noticeable in certain contexts. So for noticeability, as I'm using FSR, I'm gonna give this like a 2.5 maybe. But even if it wasn't noticeable in this game, DFR just does not seem like it's very beneficial. And here we have another big VR game, Half-Life Alyx. This is running on the 4090 at the Ultra Fidelity preset with MSAA ×2, dynamic resolution disabled, and 150% resolution in Steam VR, because in my previous video I was pretty hertz limited even without DFR. And here we can see there is quite a meaningful difference. The averages had a 21.7% difference between no DFR and the most aggressive, but in some scenes this jumps way up. Look at the conversation with Eli here. It lasts almost a solid minute, but without DFR, we are struggling at around 80 FPS. Conservative DFR is giving us a 26.6% boost to about 100 or so FPS. Balance is hovering around 105 to 107, about a 35% uplift or so, and then aggressive DFR is hanging around 110 more comfortably, providing around 39.2% over no foveation. This is not a few seconds long moment, but an entire conversation where I am having a measurably better experience due to the foveation. Were I not recording, aggressive DFR would be giving me a solid 120 FPS experience, whereas no foveation would fall just shy of even doing 90 Hz. While we don't want to get too caught up ignoring the average gains, it's still important to consider these kind of moments, as it did last nearly a minute, and if something like this were to occur even semi-often throughout a whole game, you could end up having quite a bit better experience if you are someone who's sensitive to frame rate. And in Alyx, this does seem like something that does happen now and again, because if we slightly jump ahead to Alyx having another conversation, no foveation is sitting at sub 90 FPS, while even conservative DFR is comfortably above 100. There is not as high a relative difference between the settings here, but the important thing is that any foveation at all gives quite a noticeable boost, and these occasional instances can be seen in the lows. While on average, the largest gap was only about 21.7%, and the 1% lows still didn't hit even a 30% improvement, the 0.1% lows went as high as literally a plus 60% improvement with the most aggressive form of DFR versus none. Even conservative DFR saw a 40% improvement on them. In fact, the 0.1% lows on aggressive DFR are almost as good as the 1% lows without foveation. But the good story does not stop there for Alyx, because when it comes to how noticeable DFR is, it's basically not. Unless your eye tracking is failing you, the DFR injection in Alyx is so good that I'm giving it a solid 5 out of 5 here. Even on the most aggressive settings, it is hard to notice, and on anything less than that, even attempting to seriously pixel peep is going to be an ordeal. Alyx is truly just a best case scenario for DFR. It provides some noteworthy gains, there's some semi-regular occurrences of scenes which jump well past the averages, and even the highest settings blend in pretty well for DFR. It's a no-brainer to use. Though, very important disclaimer, be sure to turn down MSAA 2x2 instead of x4 with the on-screen command. Pimax has a bug where MSAA x4 causes the foveation of any kind, fixed or dynamic, to glitch out. It is a 0 out of 5 in that case. And moving on to the laptop, we're running with the high fidelity preset with MSAA x2. It's a similarly great story, though slightly odder. On average FPS, all forms of DFR were basically identical, providing around plus 30% or so. Balance was a whole 2 FPS lower, but that's within run-to-run variance, and we all know the human eye can't see more than 60 FPS anyway. But once again, there are scenes which punch beyond the averages, like with Eli here. No DFRs in the low 40s, while we're pinging between 56 to 63 FPS depending on how aggressive the DFR is. Upwards of plus 35 to 50% is a massive improvement. Interestingly though, the conservative and balance seem to have about the same FPS in this scene, but aggressive DFR is able to maintain 60 FPS or more far more reliably, though it still sometimes does dip a little bit below that and seems to have about 8 to 10% more performance than conservative DFR. In general, the story is the same on the 3080 Ti mobile as it was on the 4090. The lows sometimes improve more noticeably though. Conservative saw around 30.6% improvement on the 1% lows, while aggressive and balanced DFR saw over plus 37%. While the 0.1% lows were so bad without DFR, they failed to even get on the board. Well, they at least did with any kind of DFR. And it is worth pointing out that balanced and aggressive DFR had 0.1% lows about 10 to 12% better than conservative did. CPU frame time saw an average increase while enabling DFR, quite a high relative increase of around 50 to 80% at that, but the lows actually weren't spaced far apart from each other. The low spike seems to be due to how Alyx handles asset loading, as you may notice some significant CPU spikes when going through loading areas, like say the elevator right here. Generally speaking, the CPU load increase from DFR was well within acceptable levels and performance is good here. Totally possible to do a fairly reliable 60 FPS reprojection, were I not recording, or a reasonably good 72Hz experience with higher levels of foveation. And I still have to give Alyx a 5 out of 5 for noticeability. Even without super sampling and dropping down one preset, DFR is very hard to notice. If you do need some extra performance, it is a no-brainer to use. Now, after looking at a case where DFR lets super sample, let's look at a case where it doesn't. I'm running Aircar at all max settings on the 4090 because if you check my previous video, I was profoundly hertz limited even without DFR and recording. Could have been pushing 160 by frame times even. So I cranked settings up to 1.2 in-game render scale and I got effectively nothing. Not even 2.5% increase on average. Sure, it's a couple FPS higher, but we are already past triple digit FPS, so who cares? Variable rate shading only affects pixel shading workloads, so if the bottleneck is elsewhere in the rasterization pipeline, then reducing it won't help you here, and it seems like that's probably the case right now. As far as noticeability though, probably 4 out of 5. The raindrops on the car, in some spots, can disappear, but otherwise I did not notice any foveation artifacts, and even that one is both rare and subtle enough. I bet some people won't notice it unless really trying to see it, even on aggressive settings. Back with the 3080 Ti mobile though, it's a completely different story. With max settings at 1.0 res, the jump from no DFR to the highest is a staggering 63.5% FPS improvement on the averages, the highest out of any test I've ever done. Interestingly, there is a large jump of about 12.6% from conservative to balanced DFR, but going up to aggressive sees virtually no gains over balanced. This kind of jump is truly mind-boggling though. It's like 2 generational leaps of performance. This is the difference between going from 45 FPS reprojection to near dropless 72 Hz, or even getting close to 90 FPS with a couple dips, were I not recording. While yes, FPS is not as important in a title like this, it's still transformative. Consistency on the 0.1% lows was rather variable though. While the average FPS and 1% lows saw no more than about 2 to 3% run-to-run variance, which is expected, the 0.1% lows saw very notable variance upwards of 30 to 50%. And I couldn't figure the reason out. And these runs on screen represent the best runs after I did a couple passes on each. CPU load was also rather variable too. It could be that the system is just really being stressed to its limits. But still, gotta rate Aircar, same as I did before, about 4, maybe 4.5 out of 5. The artifacts are borderline non-existent, and this game seems to have some incredible scaling on lower-end GPUs. And here we are, back with the problem child that vexed me so much previously. Saints and Sinners, Chapter 2. I'm running this on the 4090 with all max settings, including AA, despite the performance penalty there, because I am extremely hertz limited without AA enabled. And this game continues to confuse the hell out of me. Again, because in the opening scene, we actually see a regression of performance with DFR enabled. First time that's happened. We're bouncing between around 61 to 64 FPS with it enabled, whereas not having it enabled is a more reliable 66 FPS or so. Jump ahead to the boat ride, and the lowest level of DFR is actually doing the best though, but it's only a couple FPS difference when already bordering on 100 even without it, so this could just be run-to-run variance. This is reflected in the averages as well though, because the difference there is, basically there is no difference. Conservative DFR technically had a slight improvement on the averages outside that, but the lows were functionally the same. The higher settings saw a few percent improvement on the 0.1% lows, I guess, but that's still within run-to-run variance. And it's a shame, because when it comes to how noticeable the foveation is, I'd probably give this a 4.5 out of 5 as well in the day, and a solid 5 during the night. Maybe part of that is because it's not really doing anything for performance, but despite how unnoticeable it is, it's just not worth using on the 4090. Moving on to the 3080 Ti laptop and praying for better, it was tested on these settings at 1.0 resolution. Again, gotta know our limits with a laptop. And the results here were a bit more promising. Average FPS went up about 9.6% between no DFR and the most aggressive setting. But the lows saw upwards of around plus 22% improvement in FPS. And there are certain scenes, like talking with the old man here, where things improve a little bit more even. No DFR is sitting around 50 FPS. Conservative actually saw another regression of a few frames, but balance is sitting around 56 to 57 FPS, providing a 14% improvement over no DFR, whereas aggressive is hovering around 60, providing a 20% uplift versus no foveation. We're actually getting something meaningful now. Jumping ahead a bit to the boat ride, the gains are a little more in line with the averages, however. Sometimes we even see cases where DFR is not really providing an uplift, even on the highest setting, but it still does provide a meaningful difference overall, even if slight, though it's not so slight on the lows. So for something around this power, it's easy to recommend using foveation. You could at least do a decently stable 60 to 120 FPS reprojection, especially without the recording penalty. As for how noticeable it is, same with the 4090. 4.5 during the day, solid 5 during the night. Another best case scenario for visibility, not so much for actual performance. And there are the benchmarks and the visual analysis. Before I talk about some general conclusions though, I did test a couple other games for how noticeable DFR was. Couldn't fit them in the video either due to time or lack of a good spot to benchmark, so here's a few more. Not an extensive list, but coupled with the examples already here, I hope it gives a general idea of what you can use. The other thing I want to note is that some Unity games appear to have a bug where looking up and down is inverted. So if your eyes look up, it moves the circle down, though on the horizontal axis, it's perfectly fine. Unfortunately, I don't have any Unity-based games which work with DFR and that I can film obvious foveation artifacts with, while also showing the eye tracking data. A VR chat was one of them, but now it doesn't work with the recent Unity 2022 update, so you're just gonna have to trust me, bro. That all said, conclusions now. I'm not gonna show a chart here. If you skipped over to here expecting one, and you know who you are, as while averages are important, there were multiple cases where in scenes lasting a minute or two more, the gains could spike noticeably past the averages, and there's what happened in Skyrim. And those things are best displayed in those video in those segments. go back and watch them if you jumped here. Now that those people are gone, gotta say, DFR has some real massive potential, and I say this every time, but I wish more devs would natively support this. In best case scenarios, like Skyrim on the 4090 or Aircar on the 3080 Ti mobile, the gains feel like a legitimate generational jump, sometimes even 2 generational jumps. And that makes certain performance thresholds possible that simply weren't before. If you play a handful of titles where DFR works and sees gains like that, it's a pretty strong and legitimate selling point for something like the Crystal, as it could very well perform comparably to, even in some cases, better than something that's lower resolution. However, those kind of gains are more the exception rather than the rule, and it's going to depend on what your setup is. Higher-end GPUs generally seem to benefit less than lower-end ones, but even somewhat more modest gains like, say, Alyx on the 4090, that was the difference between an average of about 90 FPS experience or so and 120 FPS one. It even let us push 150% resolution quite comfortably. It is just a shame, though, that some games see virtually no gains at all. But more often than not, you will see at least some kind of decent uplift. However, one thing I do gotta caution about, though, is, at least with Pimax's implementation, it does sometimes seem to incur a bit of an increase on the CPU. This can vary, and in most cases it is negligible and not something to worry about. There are cases like Aircar where we saw a ridiculous uplift of over plus 60% on GPU performance, while the CPU frame times, they didn't go up at all. But then you have something like Alyx, which it saw a large benefit, and while the absolute frame times were still quite low, they still did go up by a rather high relative amount of plus 60% or so. So it's still perhaps worth keeping an eye on your CPU and your GPU, but the vast majority of the time, I think it's well worth it, since you're going to have much more CPU power to spare than GPU most of the time. Performance is not the only factor to consider, though. There is also visual quality. Yes, you could use fixed foveated rendering with any headset in OpenVR titles and tweak it to get similar gains in theory. But the important distinction here is that it's dynamic. As the headsets are getting much greater edge-to-edge clarity, things like FFR start to become more noticeable and immersion breaking. FFR on the Crystal is a lot more distracting due to how good the edge-to-edge clarity is compared to when I used it on, say, Fresnel-based HMDs that already have the edges blurred. The eye-tracked nature means that you can push more aggressive settings to get higher performance while also not sacrificing visual quality and disrupting the immersion from foveation artifacts. You can't use anywhere near as aggressive settings with FFR because of this, and there were cases where we saw another plus 10% or so by running higher foveation. But the highest setting really is aggressive, and I could see people are going to start running into problems with that in certain games. There is quite a big gap between even the balance and then the highest setting in terms of how aggressive the foveation is. But I honestly think you could run balanced in the vast majority of games and likely not notice much. If you're trying to figure out what's right for you, then I recommend starting there and seeing how you feel. And there is the video. Thank you for watching. What do you think of the dynamic foveated rendering? Are you as excited about it as I am? I sure wish more people could use this. If you like what I did, consider sticking around, see what I'll do next. Maybe I'll take a look at a deep dive on Skyrim with dynamic foveated rendering specifically. And if you don't stick around, well, thanks for stopping by anyway. Maybe I will see you again sometime in the recommendeds. Later.